out of the 1980s and into the 1990s. Before we get to what's on the tray, Ken, few of the brands which come to mind in the 1990s for you would be?
Well, from both ends, brand new and revived, you've got Blancpain and Franck Muller, and actually a third brand, Ulysse Nardin. In the first half of the 1990s, with a watch revival starting its trajectory, it wasn't just Rolex and Patek and Audemars and Vacheron, the established brands. For some reason, there was a real craving for these new brands, although, for example, Blancpain and the others that were revived were ancient brands, Panerai. What happened was you had a whole generation of people with disposable income. I think the term was city boys, for example, getting bonuses, and watches became a thing. And 30 years on, it's hard for people to realize that the three hottest watches in the early 90s included the absolutely classic Blancpain Villeret, which you remember, white dial, small, thin gold watch, the Franck Muller Casablanca with the salmon pink dial, and salmon pink is very much back in vogue. And the third one was the Ulysse Nardin Marine Chronometer.
Yeah, 1846.
And again, Ulysse Nardin had been there all along, but like Girard-Perregaux, it wasn't one of the brands, I don't want to say A-list, it just wasn't one of the brands that was in everyone's consciousness, like Rolex, Cartier, and Patek. And Cartier is an important one to mention because throughout this entire period, the periods we've been talking about, every single decade, Cartier has been there. And that is a particularly important example because the Tank was one of the earliest wristwatches, along with the Santos. And this is an exquisite interpretation of what even then was already an 80-year-old plus design.
Yes, I mean, the reason why I've brought out the Tank Francaise here, Ken, is because obviously the Tank came about in 1917. And once again, if you had to list the top 5 most significant watches of
all time,
then the Tank would be in there, absolutely. The Tank Francaise, which was launched in 1996, I remember going over to Switzerland for the launch. And
was that at SIH?
Correct. Yes, and it was a very successful launch to the point that we would go to subsequent Basel fairs and SIH fairs, and the immediate success of this model meant that we would kind of benchmark other brands. When they launched a ladies model, we'd say, how would that compare to the Tank Francaise? So for me, when I think of the 90s, I think of the success of this particular model.
Oh, and there have been plenty of brands that have tried to do lookalikes.
For sure, and they will continue to do so.
This
for me, if in my opinion, it's probably the most significant introduction in my lifetime of the Coaxial by George Daniel, which was launched many years before the 1990s, but it actually came out in the 1990s, 1999.
Well, George had a problem convincing the Swiss that it was in advance.
Tell us about it.
Well, this actually brings pangs of what we call seller's remorse, because I had one of the first series Omega Co-Axials. George is still regarded as the greatest watchmaker of the 20th century, or the greatest post-Breguet watchmaker of all time. And the coaxial movement was a serious advance. Most watchmaking, in fact, involves technologies or concepts that are hundreds of years old. And the primary changes over the centuries have been materials and lubricants. More modern, for now, I think you might recommend instead of every 2 years, you can get away with 5 years for a watch. But George was after a wiser way of making an escapement, and part of it was to remove the curse of all watches, which is lubrication. And the coaxial, he ultimately convinced Nicholas Hayek Sr. at Omega to adopt it. And I believe it now powers all Omegas.
Absolutely.
I foolishly sold mine to buy another watch off my bucket list, which happens to be a Breguet. But you do these things as a collector. We're never happy, and I'm regretting it deeply because it was a watch with a closer connection to George. He actually signed the owner's certificates in it.
Okay.
But that's watches under the bridge.
Yeah.
This is probably a better watch because I seem to recall that the first generation.
We did have some issues.
Tell us about it.
We did have some issues with some other watches coming back in the early days.
From the ones that came out in '99?
Correct, yes. But obviously since then, it's been absolutely perfected.
Marvelous.
No issue whatsoever. But I'd say for me, the co-axial, when we were actually putting this together, I was thinking, there's one watch, there's one era, absolutely.
What I would love to say, I won't be around then, but I'd like to know 50 years from now what watch historians will say about the coaxial. What's distracted people from it is it seems that the industry en masse has embraced silicon for parts and the movements. And I know watchmakers that are not that happy with it because if you need to replace a silicon part and you can't get that silicon part, you can't fashion it the way any serious watchmaker with a lathe and the right tools can handle machining parts from precious metals or even steel. The only thing that's a real problem for people is if a spring goes. The silicon, I understand the need for innovation, but this isn't just innovation for the sake of it. It really was an advance, and it probably will be what George is remembered for, alongside reviving our knowledge of a lot of things in the past, especially Breguet, which I believe was super close to his heart.